Okay, everybody, we are in a gigantic room for a really vulnerable conversation. So those of you who are sitting out on the edges, we applaud and salute you. You know, that's what I do too. But if you wouldn't mind just like coming in and collecting a little bit, we're going to be asking David Hardy to like reveal his soul to you in this conversation.
I don't know if I'm ready for that.
And if he has to do that like by shouting out to the back 40 back there, it's just going to change the whole dynamic here. So if you want to hear him whisper the really good stuff because it's hard for him to say, see how I'm setting you up?
Yeah, no pressure.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming on in. So we have promised you real talk. What it looks like when real change meets all of the systems, all the cultures, all the mindsets that everybody here recognizes as the reasons why change can be so hard. What does that look like? And can we please hear it from somebody who will just tell us the unvarnished truth? David Hardy. So before we get to David Hardy, my name's Andy Calkins. I live in Gloucester, not too far from here. I run a national nonprofit called Next Gen Learning Challenges, NGLC, nextgenlearning.org on your radio dial. It's a horrible name for an initiative, but basically we were created 10 years ago to challenge the whole field of K-12 education to reinvent itself. And you can go to nextgenlearning.org and find out how we've gone about doing that. David and I met through a leadership development thing that the Aspen Institute runs called the Pahara Institute. So we have gotten to know each other, walking around mountains in Aspen, Colorado, which is a really good place to get to know people. And then Learn Launch, without knowing that we knew each other, threw us together up here. And so there's like a masterful piece of like serendipity happening here.
Indeed.
They were interested in having me or someone from NGLC lead this session because we're in the midst now of what will be a 3-year-long project to explore what it looks like in a tiny handful of places, 6 districts nationally, to do this kind of change towards radically different 21st century student outcomes in a fundamentally different way. What does it look like when your starting premise is, if we're going to get to a form of learning that is driven by agency and by an expectation that we want students to be, fully realized young adults ready to go out into a complex world, then the adults that are surrounding them in schools have to be working in a professional culture that reflects all of the attributes of that learning model. That sounds like, okay, that makes a whole lot of sense, but it's like the hardest thing for communities and school districts that are deeply bought into an old world idea of what motivates people to do good work, which is all about carrots and sticks and orderly linear processes, and not at all about actually giving up power and enlisting and expanding and emergent kinds of change. That is happening, and we're going to spend like the last 5 to 10 minutes here in this session looking briefly at what that looks like so that nobody's leaving here feeling suicidal about the possibilities here. But on the way there, we're going to talk about David's experience in Lorain, which he has recently left, which makes him a really dangerous person because, he can't get in any more trouble than he's already been.
That's right.
Is that a safe bet?
It is.
So to organize our conversation, before we jump in, anything else you want to say about yourself to introduce yourself to your new best friends here who are?
No, I'm excited to have this conversation, and I hope it's okay if the filter does come off a little bit as we talk about this. Is that okay with you all? Okay, great. And you did a great job setting us up, by the way.
Thank you. It's just out of curiosity, how many people in this room stopped over in the Learning Showcase earlier this morning to see what the kids and the teams were doing over there? Yeah, so hold on to that thought and that image while you're experiencing what we're going to talk through here today, because it can happen. It's just we have to be truthful about what's in the way to making that happen in the ways that you're seeing over there across the hall. So to organize our conversation, this is part of what's come out of our research into these 6 districts. This is what they have told us they have been grappling with. They knew they would grapple with, and that this is part of the reason why they have done this work in a very, very different way than their sort of knee-jerk way of organizing a linear form of change. We organize them in 3 columns: the blinkers, the blindfold, and the Ray-Bans. So the blindfold, right, it all has to do with lack of consensus around the vision that you're shooting for, right? Vision these days is basically set by what we're all being held accountable for, right? It's because that's what the lists are, and that's how you are ranked in your states and so on. And when you try to change that or expand it or deepen it, this is what a lot of what you see. You're probably reading these lines. Those of you who are, who's a district person here? And a school level leader, teacher? And community leader, school board people? Okay. So David,
Yeah.
Looking at this set of vision-related challenges,
Sure.
just tell us a couple of stories about some of what you experienced in Lorain, and maybe start with a little preface about when you got there and what you were trying to do.
Sure. So in 2017, I was introduced in July, and that was right at the end of the timeline that they had to identify a CEO for a state takeover in the city of Lorain. So the CEO of the city of Lorain has the power of the school board and that of the superintendent. So you can imagine the school board at the time becoming isolated, and someone coming in from the outside, a complete stranger to Lorain, was not a popular position to sit in. However, the reality of the situation is it's a $310 million school district that funds about 6,500 kids, majority Latinx population, second to African American, about 25-30% African American, and about 20-25% Caucasian American kids. In a situation where, when you look at our state report card, we have been failing in every one of the categories for the past 15 years in a row.
Every one.
Every single one. The only one that we've seen any growth was in reading, where we got a D, but if you look at the metric for reading, only 27% of our kids were reading on grade level, and that got us a D. So to me, that's failing across the board. Then when you look at it just another level down, and you look at how our kids are prepared for success, 1.1% of our kids were leaving high school prepared for college and beyond. So we had a graduating class of 450 kids every single year, and we're talking 6 kids for the past 15 to 20 years are leaving the system ready for life. And I kid you not, like Kelvin, for example, is one I see him now at Walmart. He left high school, graduated, and is now, working somewhere where he's just trying to get by. And so what are we really doing?
Yeah.
So that's what I walked into in 2017.
How widely was that known around the community, that the schools were in that kind of shape?
It was the loudest, quietest conversation, if that makes sense. It was something that every individual family knew, but could not talk about. Main reason is that you had a large community of Latinx families and African American families who have been oppressed in a degree that they couldn't speak up. They had no real representation within City Hall. They didn't have any real representation on the school board, and fell victim to the politics of the city.
Who was on the school board?
Yeah, so you had like a generational kind of family approach to the school board. So the head of the school board, who we'll probably talk a little bit more later, It was kind of in the lineage of, kind of other folks in his family that have kind of come up through being in political leadership and attached themselves to another family where it's literally a individual who runs the city of Lorain, and if you're attached to him, you're okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is one of those situations where the de facto job, thinking of like Clayton Christensen these days, what is the job to be done? The job to be done is as much about this being the biggest employer in town and who gets those jobs and who wins those contracts.
Absolutely.
Than it is about the kids.
Absolutely. So we were, $310 million put us just behind the hospital in the city, and there was zero other industry. So it's a Rust Belt town right off the lake in Ohio, Lake Erie in Northeast Ohio, and Ford left, steel has left, and so there's zero other jobs other than working in the hospital or school system. So jobs are scarce.
And yet they brought you in, like change-making, troublemaker.
Yes.
Well, how did that happen?
So there was a commission, an outside commission appointed by a combination of the state, a member of the school board, and a member from the mayor's office that combined to, set forth and identify a leader. They went outside, so the chair, who's probably the most brave individual that I've met, came up and said, we're not selecting anyone from in Lorain. Put a panel of 5 individuals in front of the community and said, here are the folks that are potentially going to run this school district, none of which had any real tie to Lorain City.
This is how long ago?
This is 3 years ago.
3 years ago, okay. So if it weren't for all that outside direction, there's no way the current city power groups would have brought you in.
No way.
No, okay.
No, they wouldn't have brought me in. They wouldn't have changed anything. They would have kept probably the current or the past superintendent in place because they believed he was moving in the right direction.
But so with all of these failures on the performance standards and everything, so far this is actually the system responding pretty well. I mean,
yeah.
The state is saying this is a failed system.
Yeah.
It's not able to govern itself. Let's create a process for them to bring in somebody who can shake this up.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
So then what happened as you tried to adjust people's vision around what their schools could be?
Sure. A few things happened. One, the initial conversations with those that were in power was an attempt to broker a relationship and say, hey, how can we work together? What are the working relationships that we can establish so that we can focus on kids and maybe put some of the other things to the side, but tend to them as we need be. The response I received was threefold. One, do you still want to buy that baseball field that the last superintendent wanted to buy? So again, nothing about education. They were going to sell me this baseball field for $1 that had $1 million worth of damage to, and because the city wanted to get it off its books. So that was one of the first conversations.
Okay.
The second conversation.
Was that sort of, are you willing to play the game with us?
Absolutely.
That was okay.
That was, no pun intended, but that was the softball kind of thrown up to say, hey, will you play?
Okay.
And
you said?
I said absolutely not. I actually, to the point where, I thought, well, let me at least check it out. Mm-hmm. And I went to the field and I literally was at least up to mid-calf in just mud. Like it was in ruins.
Yeah.
But the city no longer could pay for it. Mm. And so they figured, well, you have $310 million. You can shave off $1 million to pay for a field we don't want. But that was going to be $1 million that we're going to take away from my kids.
Yeah.
And I refused to do it. The second was an evolving conversation because we've really tried to engage the school board and build a relationship to some degree where we had a common understanding that the powers rest within us, mm-hmm. And that we could work together if you're willing to support the efforts to help kids. Mm-hmm. And as time went on, it just got progressively worse and they became more and more aggressive, to the point just recently within the past 3 months, I received a Facebook post that told me to go back to where I came from in red, black, and green. Yeah. So the reality of the situation, they didn't want me there at all.
They wanted you to go back to Africa.
That's correct.
Basically.
That's correct. And that was the message they were trying to tell me for 2.5 years.
Wow. Okay. So in the work to try to adjust people's vision, were there any bright spots? I mean, were there places either on your restructured district team or out in some of the schools, teacher teams, where some of that took root?
Absolutely. I think one of the first places, and it's always the brightest spot, is when you get a response from kids. So one of the things, it was a smaller thing that we tried to do, and it was trying to establish a mindset that everything is possible if you just believe. And we changed the idea of calling our kids students to scholars, which was pretty darn controversial for this town. And I remember the meeting where I introduced the idea that we want to elevate our kids to realize that they could be what they could aspire to. And I remember Amani in the back of the room, unprompted. She was sitting by herself. She's about 14 years of age, was listening to this whole presentation, and stood up and asked if she could be a scholar. So here's a kid who's asking for that love, for that attention, for that elevation of worth. So that just was like, wow. So kids realize what they're going through and want something different. That's one piece. Yeah. The second piece, you have teachers there that literally would come up to you. So if you could imagine walking down the hall and we're walking in opposite directions, they would stop me, whisper something, and then say, please don't tell anybody, and walk the other direction. Wow. So there are individuals who wanted better, but realized that they couldn't be seen as part of the change.
Okay. What did they fear would happen to them if they became more visible?
Yeah, everything. They always saw this type of change as something that would be fleeting, right? We've heard the statement before, this too shall pass, and people say that unfortunately way too often when it comes to kids and change and progress. But they felt after this regime kind of came in and left, they would have to deal with those that were in power. And they were fearful of everything from their job and their personal well-being to their ability to work with their other peers who may or may not be aligned with actually changing and doing right for kids.
Wow.
So it became a situation of like survival for teachers versus actually education of kids.
Yeah. Okay, so safe to say the job wasn't completed for you to get the whole district bought into a richer, deeper, more ambitious 21st century definition of student success.
Correct. It was
you were okay.
Yep.
Let's go to the blinkers.
Yeah.
So the blinkers, right? I went doing this research in this deck, we came across the fact that there is a product out there that are human blinkers that, like the horses wear on a horse track, to help people focus on like what they're working on right now. You can go to Amazon and buy them. You can get anything these days, including something, anyway. So blinkers have to do with everyone being so deeply immersed in the current system, current mindsets, that it's just hard to imagine it operating in any different kind of way, right? And so, right now, we're 20 years into accountability-driven, standards-based reform. It's hard for an entire generation of young teachers who learned that way and sort of succeeded in that way and now are teaching in that way to imagine, any better version of that or different version of learning than that. Tell a story or two about your efforts there and what happened.
Yeah. We started with this notion of what if we just help teachers see what kids actually engage with every single day. And most of our kids, most of us, walk around every single day with a computer in our hands, but we happen to just call them cell phones now, right? And for whatever reason, there's this disconnect that this device in our hand couldn't be used as a tool to actually learn. And we tried to just show teachers initially to say, like, let's think outside the box. Knowing that our kids learn and are attached to these things that they can't seem to get out of their hands, how can we use that to think differently on how we educate them? Wasn't widely received, but we tried. The second then, we said, all right, let's build the parameters and or the behaviors potentially to change the way that we teach and learn, and brought in standards-based grading. So this idea of instead of giving a kid in a class an A for being quiet, we're actually going to grade them based on the mastery of the skills that they're actually learning based on aligned to standards,
Yeah.
right? Novel idea. Met with a ton of resistance. Unbelievable resistance. How dare you tell me that I haven't been teaching this way, I've been doing this, fill in the blank. However, there were still nuggets of teachers who said, you know what, this is eye-opening. I didn't realize, one, I wasn't teaching to the level of the standards. Two, I didn't even know those were the standards. And three, how do I get better? So there was glimmers of hope, but the majority were so resistant to the idea that they had to think differently or just to the left or the right of where they were, that the idea of embracing the idea and being aligned to someone from the outside and state and everything else, add those layers, was something that people just couldn't grab hold on to.
Was there anywhere where there was enough of voice from people who were intrigued that it started to gain a foothold in a school and change that culture?
Yeah, there were a number of elementary schools that said, you know what, this makes sense. And the reason why it started to make sense is because they started to see their kids grow. Yeah. And it was those small steps of seeing, how kids were now creating better arguments, or the small steps of saying now kids are comprehending text more deeply and asking the right questions and pushing even the teachers thinking. You could see that teachers felt so good about that.
Yeah.
And that permeated certain buildings.
Yeah.
So that was positive. That was the piece that we were trying to anchor ourselves on, because at the end of the day, that was teacher driven. I think teachers are the most important people in this puzzle. Yeah. And once they get going and are elevated to the degree of understanding and love for and from their kids, they can do anything. Yeah. And so in those schools, that's where that happened, is where that love and consideration and understanding is taking place.
So in retrospect, now looking at the way this is all played out, is there anything you might have done differently to nurture and elevate the voices of those teachers and the work they were doing with those kids, so that this would have been seen as a more sort of ground up, grassroots, local people leading it change than the outsider being the problem?
Yeah, I think about that every single day, Andy. Because it's okay. No, I think about it a lot because there were enough folks that would step up in pockets, and they would do it at certain points, but not in front of a large audience. Right? Yeah. They wanted to remain anonymous. So I struggle with trying to figure out, how do I elevate these voices? Why not exposing them to, unfortunately, circumstances and people that may not agree, but also pushing them to see that you actually are right. Yeah. You're doing the right thing for kids. So I would definitely approach it differently. I think I would have probably thought about, because at the time I kind of tried to go through union leadership, and that was a roadblock. I wonder if I would have went a different direction with building level leaders, that it maybe had a different outcome.
So while these 3 years were unfolding, the school board and the contracts with unions and everything were still intact. And so it wasn't like there was a whole new governance thing and the people would have felt a little safer because of that.
Right. Right. No, nothing like that had changed. Governance, yes, from the school board side, but as far as union contracts, I did not touch.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so let's go to the third one. At the end of this third column, we're going to turn to you guys and invite you to ask any questions of David you would like to. So keep track of stories he's telling, anything that you want to hear anything more on as we're going. The Ray-Bans, right, have to do with identity and culture, which these 6 districts that we're working with will say lie at the root of everything. You're not going to be able to take on the kinds of things that David was trying to take on until you figure out a way to do as you were trying to do and still think about what it might have looked like every day in building more trust, building collective efficacy across the teachers, so that they begin to feel that sense of agency that in the end we want to help instill with their kids. So lack of risk-taking, agency among teachers and staff, all the whole blaming the students, blaming society, blaming poverty thing, very little readiness, which we've already heard about, to show vulnerability openness to learning, asking questions, all of that.
Yeah, two things come out. We had a newer teacher come on board, and he was looking to teach science. And he came in, a ton of ideas, wanted to push the envelope, get kids, a lot of what we saw a few minutes ago from kids a few minutes ago here, where just getting our kids to be exposed to the world around them in a way that they hadn't been for so long. And so he went to, I believe it was his science chair or someone to ask for, hey, where do I get some supplies?
Yeah.
And his response that he received was, we don't do that here. Here's your set of packets, lead from that. That only doubled down to a situation where he was then kind of like pushed and cajoled to even do less, and he actually quit 2 weeks later. So here was this gentleman who had innovation in heart and mind, and was completely told that wasn't something we did.
Yeah.
Another example, and it comes up a lot, which is unfortunate, is that if we just had more parents engaged, we just had more parents show up to PTO meetings.
Right.
When in the reality, when you think about some of our parents, and I go back and forth on this all the time, like, how important is parent engagement? What are we actually asking for from parents? How can we use technology to help engage parents differently? But I come back to a gentleman who came to one of our town halls and said, there are parents who want to be quote unquote more engaged, or better yet, are engaged, but you just don't see them because they have a choice. They have $5. That $5 is in their pocket. In Lorain, there's one bus that runs through that town. They can use that $5 to potentially travel to your PTO meeting, or they can use that $5 to feed their kids. What choice do you want them to make? Right? And I was like, I get it. I understand that. So for me, it was like, instead of other adults blaming adults for them not doing their job, how can we create a community of understanding and empathy to surround our kids and families differently?
Were there any mechanisms in the district at all to surface those voices and help them become like better known, more recognized, and more currency given to them?
Yeah, so we tried a few different methods around creating just what we called our Family Action Network. FAN, which was a way for families to engage with parents. So not seeing us as the district leading this charge, but us as individual parents coming together to support other parents. And that gained a little bit of traction. The idea was right, and I think it's something that the district can continue to grow on. But to the degree in which it could have transformed the district, still waiting to see if that will pan out.
Were you given extra powers, extra latitude, extra budget when you came in, courtesy of this state semi-receivership kind of thing, so that you had some assets to play with, or was there not much? It was current budget, current budget, but the freedom and latitude I had is that, in traditional school districts, you go through more of an RFP process, you go through more intricate processes that have to go through the school board for approval. It just took a signature from me. So when we needed to, bring in a support to kids in teaching and learning, professional development, so be it. It was literally a much shorter window. It was a conversation with myself, my team, and those that would be involved, and then signing a contract and going. So that was the latitude we had, but we didn't have any increased funding behind it, which was fine. In a district of our size, I actually found that if we had less money, we would probably be more efficient. I think it's sometimes counterintuitive that people think you need more money, more people. Actually, if you make it more scarce, the amount of money more scarce, you're probably going to be more productive. So I actually thought we had plenty of money. Money wasn't the issue.
Never the issue.
What was your per pupil expenditure?
Oh goodness, actual versus like what was projected in the state. I think in the state it was like 8,000 or 9,000, but I would say we were probably more like 12,000 to 15,000 with everything that came from Title I, Title II, and Title III services. Yeah.
I'll tell you a story from a visit we made to one of our districts outside of Denver just right before Christmas that may make you cry. But this was a district that has been at work for 10 years, St. Vrain, to develop this kind of culture. And one of the schools that we visited, middle school, the principal, when they really made the commitment to leap into this work, trying to come up with a sort of theatrical way of telling the teachers it's okay to take risks, fail, get up, try again. They printed out and laminated Monopoly get out of jail free cards and gave the teachers an unlimited supply of those cards and basically said, you know, this, you know, if you want proof that we mean what we're talking about here, you know, and you don't need approval from us to try something that is like in line with this big vision that we've got, go. And if it blows up in your face and you've got parents yelling at us and everything and you're afraid for your job and whatever else, you go ahead, pull this out. You know, here it is, license, go for it. And the teachers all smiling, but they say it actually kind of meant something.
That's powerful.
So yeah.
That's powerful.
So we're going to take 2 minutes right now. I'm going to ask each of you to find a person right near you. Look at this slide, especially if one of you is in the schools right now, but if both of you are, even better. You probably have been having an undercurrent in your head of, you know, what you have experienced yourself in the categories suggested here for what has confronted you that has made it hard for you to do the kinds of changes you want to do. Tell that story in a minute to the person next to you. And then we'll take a time for Q&A and for anybody to surface the story that they just told or out the person who told it to them and tell that story for them. Okay, ready? Go. Okay, we're going to call you back. Sorry to interrupt all this great conversation that's happening out there. If any of you are like left your partner at a cliffhanger moment, you know, just don't let them fall off the cliff. You know, at the end of the session, tell them the rest of the story. We will find time for David to tell you the closing chapter of his story, just so you can wrap this into a bow. But anybody now, open mic, and I think we do want to use mics, right? So yes, we've got one. Questions or a fast rendition of a story? Have you got a mic over there? Oh, yes, okay, thanks.
Rock, paper, scissors.
Is this on? Hey, thank you for the time. So it seems like this is, I'm sure that Lorain is idiosyncratic and unique in many ways, as every school district is, but it feels like there's a larger narrative around state takeover, TFA-led charter reform mindset, right? A lot of initial resistance, a lot of kind of politics back and forth. We've seen this in Newark, New Orleans, Detroit. I don't know, you've been in there. What do you think is the meaningful way forward, I guess, right? What are, even if you don't have solutions, what are thoughts in your head?
Yeah, great question. After seeing what is happening to kids, I don't think the answer is stop and play the politics. But I don't think the answer is ignore them either. I think there's a real reality that we're running into a situation, and I'm clouded also by just the dynamics of our country as well, that the narrative is becoming so polarizing between you're either on this side or this side that we don't have a nuanced conversation in the middle. And so I think the path forward is to realize and get more people to see we're undereducating kids across this country, and unfortunately it's disproportionately children of color. And that we need to have a real conversation around that and continue to push hard. So there are going to be people like me, and I probably will do it again and hit my head up against the wall again and go after it one more time. But I think that needs to be at the forefront of folks' mind, that we can and have to keep pushing forward, but also understanding that we need to pay attention to the people that are pushing against us a little bit more closely. Great question.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, David, my question has to do, so first of all, I'll say that I imagine you're aware that school transformation, district transformation is not a one-person show. Clearly, you were the face of the change you were trying to make. So I'm just curious, like, when you think about your team, the folks who you brought in, who were already there, like, what were some of the insights you got from that, in terms of how you went about selecting them, who stuck around through the tough times,
Sure.
and what changes they were able to make alongside your leadership?
Sure. So when I talk about how lucky I am to stand on the shoulder of giants, that is not an understatement. I have unbelievable people that went to bat for me every single day, went to bat for kids, not for me, for kids every single day. And what they were able to do is to counterbalance some of the negativity through the audiences that kind of surrounded them. So for example, my team was made up of 3 or 4 folks that came in from the outside and 3 or 4 folks that were from the inside. And that was pretty intentional because I wanted a good balance, but also people that knew what was right for kids and were going to fight for it. And every single day, they were able to create systems and conversations that said, hey, you know what? This is the change we've been asking for the past 15 years, right? Just a different face that's trying to ask for it, a different team that's trying to ask for it. And they were the voice of reason in those moments when I know I couldn't step in the room, whether by my appearance or just because I wasn't local. And so I feel so compelled even to this day to say that I did nothing. It was the individuals that were there every single day dealing with a lot of the conversations that were unfortunately happening.
Yeah. Microphone is behind you, but you can come next.
I just wanted to make people aware of 3 resources. One is the Wallace Foundation did a study, The Urban Superintendent, The Impossible Job. It's online, it's over 100 pages. And there's also a book called The Black Superintendent, Messiah or Scapegoat that's got that talks about how that position is responsible for ruining more careers than just about any other position. And I also wanted
Sounds
to
like a
say,
must-read.
in Massachusetts, the Department of Elementary and Secondary now has an initiative going called Influence 100, and they're mentoring people of color who want to become superintendents to try to get more representation.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing.
Oh, hi. Thanks for your story. It's fascinating, but I can't leave without hearing what successes you did have, because clearly you turned around academics. So if you could give us your top 3 successes.
Sure. And I will say, as a district, our success, it was unbelievable people that figured out how to fight through it all. There are 2 or 3 things that jump out. One is really exciting. Again, that report card that I mentioned at the beginning, that had been an F across the board for the past 15, 20 years, we actually elevated to a D for the first time in 15 years. Amongst the 6 components, our achievement gap score went from 6% to 87%. So we closed the gap amongst our African American and Latinx populations. And the state superintendent actually came out and said, and committed to the fact, after looking at numbers, that we were one of the fastest growing and improving districts, in the top 10% in the state. So out of 609 school districts, we were in the top 10. So those are the things that feel good, and I hope that people realize the hard work that an unbelievable amount of people did behind the scenes to make it happen. And those are the things that I will remember. So thank you for asking the question.
And let's take that opportunity. So in spite of that, top 10% of districts improving in the state, just take a moment to tell us the end game and what happened that ended up forcing you out.
Yeah. So it was a combination of a few things. I knew that we were lucky enough to get some of those results. We also realized that we still weren't getting enough, right? There was a lot of kids that were falling through the cracks, and it wasn't okay. So I spoke to a lot of community members and said, well, what do we need to do? And we thought a lot about creating this, what we called our system of excellent schools, in which we would internally create some changes for communities and schools to improve. And that means internally we would tier our schools and provide different interventions and supports. And so our initial tier landed one of our schools in reconstitution mode, in which we would go in and change staff. presented that to the staff. Within a few days, I got a call from the state superintendent and said that I could not do that. The next day, teachers had signs throughout the whole school said, "We won," and plastered up throughout the entire building. So that was the beginning of the end for me from that standpoint. And at that point, it was more just landing the plane than trying to elevate.
Would you normally have expected the state superintendent to back you up in that moment? I mean, was that a surprise?
Yes.
And-
Yes, it was a huge surprise. But the complexity of the House bill, if you Google any of this, you would see that it's just got cleared through the Senate, and they're doing some repeals to the reform anyway. So it's not tremendously surprising, but I would hope that I would have had a little air cover.
It's possible there were conversations behind the scenes that were from the city powers.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you for asking that question. Yeah.
First off, thank you so much for sharing these experiences with us. And second, I've spent the last 3 years trying to understand and solve problems related to school bus safety and controlling the high costs of transportation for student mobility. How do you think about actually creating equitable transportation systems so people can get to and from school the right way at an affordable price?
Yeah. So you know what? There was this interesting model and I'm going to blank the city in Tennessee, but it was interesting that they actually went to kind of trying to create like an Uberized way of transporting kids. And so they hadn't mastered it, but they were kind of dealing with, yes, there are school buses, but there are other ways that kids need to get to school. How can we potentially hire parents? Community members in a way that will allow kids to get to and from school in a safe manner without the absorbent costs of a lot of school buses in other ways. So, and it also will allow a lot more personalized to and from school, where school busing may not always be best for kids, where we had kids walking a quarter of a mile, half a mile, and it's -5 degrees in Northeast Ohio. So that was an option that we thought about, never actually realized, but I think that is something that school districts could look into.
One last question. Yeah, go ahead. You need a microphone just for the feedback there.
Thank you so much, David, for your being vulnerable and sharing this with us, and also for the work that you did there. A question I have is, what are the things that you would do differently to address those 3 areas that are identified over there? Just some examples of things that you might do differently next time.
Yeah, so can we have another 45 minutes? Honestly, because there's so many things that I would change my approach towards, one of which is understanding from that very high level, the macro level of the politics of where this bill actually sat before entering, right? I came in thinking that there was a bill, there was some coverage from the state level that we can come in and actually follow through on, which the bill says we could, and that wasn't the reality. So I would have done a ton of more research around that. I would have spent a lot more time thinking about the 5 to 7 people who have completely disrupted how we were approaching this work, and getting them in a room frequently to talk with them and just bring them along and pump them up to see that they could be a part of the solution, and probably the biggest part of the solution, so they can carry it through once we leave. And then 3, I think it spends a lot of time with understanding the dynamic between teacher and kid, and spending more time understanding what is at the center of our teachers' hearts, and help and build a deeper bank of empathy around the challenges that they face. Because I think what's so ignored about our teachers, unfortunately, is that we assume they're not trying their best. But no teacher I know wakes up saying that they want to do a bad job for kids. And so how do we better understand the challenges teachers face so that we can build them up to help our kids become more successful?
And that is a perfect segue to the end of our session and to another resource. For those of you who are interested to learn more about how this is happening, even in places with 100% poverty and many of the same dynamics to start with that David was experiencing in Lorain, nextgenlearning.org, the initiative we're working on is called Transformation Science. It's the science of this kind of transformation, next-gen change management. I won't go through this diagram here, and you won't find it yet on the site because we're still working on it. But it is basically a story for how these districts are operating on that premise that I told you about at the start of the session. You know, what does it look like when you try to have the adults operate in a culture that reflects all of those agency-driven attributes that we're trying to bring to the kids? This is what they're doing. They're trying to move from that left-hand column, the prevailing model, so incredibly resilient because it is so consistent, right? It's all about carrots and sticks, compliance, hierarchy, and linear path, to this emergent model, which is how many of today's fast-moving, most innovative companies and organizations are operating. And now some school districts believe it. It's happening. Let's give it up for David Hardy. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you.